Fran, you're just back from Davos, and the number one agenda item, at least unofficially, seems from all your broadcasting and reporting to have been the Donald. Is that right?
Yeah, he was thousands of miles away from the Swiss town of Davos, but I have to say it was the talk of the possible return of Donald Trump to the White House that everyone was talking about, and how you Trump-proof the economy. If you can Trump-proof the economy, the impact he could have on, of course, inflation and on globalization overall.
And there was a shift as well. So there was a sort of the dominant strain from afar to us in London seemed to be that there was a kind of, oh, right, we have to accept that he might be coming back to the White House. But then there seemed to be a rearguard, yes, don't worry, it's all containable, there won't be much change.
And some people, Allegra, dealt with it with a little bit of humor. So we asked Christine Lagarde about what a Trump presidency, Trump 2.0 means. And she kind of made everyone laugh by saying, let me grab a cup of coffee.
It's for the American people to decide what they want. But obviously, we are all concerned about it because the United States is the largest economy, the largest defense country in the world.
But it's tricky, Fran, because Boris Johnson wrote a piece this week about actually all the evidence we have from last time Donald Trump was in power was that, this was a man we could do business with. And in it, he singles out Lagarde as, sort of grand dame of Europe's left. In his words, or some metaphor similar, her clutching her pearls was kind of what Donald Trump is there to do. He's there to kind of shake things up.
And there's still so much we don't know about Donald Trump, who his running mate is, but also what kind of composition of Congress he'll have. Adam Posen was talking about that.
Everything changes if Trump wins, and mostly for bad ways. Speaking as an economist, I think the reality is the American electorate is going to be more strategic. If Trump wins, the Democrats will likely hold the House. If Biden wins, the Republicans will likely hold the Senate. And so it's going to be about this sort of stealth fiscal policy.
But if you're a chief executive or if you're an investor or you're a policymaker, I think you probably have to game theory what it means in terms of some of the policies that sometimes do come out of the blue to try and make sure that you have your house in order. I know there's also talks and rumors about, European Union looking at leadership after the elections to make sure that they have someone strong enough to possibly counter the US if Donald Trump was in the White House. And then we spoke to the finance minister of Germany, and he just took issue with the fact that we're talking about Donald Trump too much.
We are talking too much about Donald Trump in Europe, and we should prepare ourselves for a possible second term for Donald Trump by fostering our European competitiveness.
But whether you think we're talking about Donald Trump too much, we have to try and figure out what the possible Trump presidency the second time around means for the economy. Welcome to In the City, Bloomberg's podcast connecting you to the conversations and the stories shaping the world of finance. I'm Francine and Lacqua.
And I'm Allegra Stratton.
So this week, a look at really what impact 4 more years of Trump in the White House will have on economies around the world. With us, Bloomberg head of economics and government, Stephanie Flanders. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. We were together in Davos, where definitely the decision makers were sizing up the global risks of another Trump presidency.
Yeah, I think people are looking and realizing that this is, a very serious possibility. And I think you saw a couple of strands. You saw a general kind of unease about the uncertainty that was going to bring at a time when, heaven knows we already have quite a lot of uncertainty in the global economy. But there was another interesting strand, which I thought was, a lot of big business leaders, particularly who are based in the US, really wanting to get away from the kind of extreme rhetoric that you often hear on the campaign, and certainly has been part of the Biden administration's pitch against Trump, that he's a risk to democracy and all of these things. I think that, the head of JP Morgan, JP Diamond, specifically pushed back on that and was, in a sense, you could say he was trying to normalize Trump. He's certainly trying to normalize the campaign between these two and say, look, we shouldn't think this is about preventing a dictatorship. We should consider these to be two serious politicians.
Because, the thing we've seen in the UK was obviously the Boris Johnson piece, which was a different version of the same Jamie Dimon worldview, Steph, which was, hold on a second, it might not be as bad as all that. And I think there's a number of reasons for it. The sort of really unkind observation is Trump was quite good for the wealthy, and Jamie Dimon's clearly wealthy, and indeed Boris Johnson's got quite wealthy recently. too. But the sort of less unkind and more sort of high-minded version or interpretation of it is that, fundamentally Trump has a huge number of supporters and represents a view in America and indeed a view in other countries and a constituency that feels quite aggrieved and quite voiceless. And so trying to connect with those people as well might be on the mind, certainly of someone like Boris Johnson. But also you do wonder as well whether someone like Boris Johnson is thinking, is there possibly, if you have a President Trump, like what role is there for someone like him? You've already seen Nigel Farage out on the campaign trail for Trump. As it becomes clearer to people that Trump is wrapping this up quite quickly, dare I say it, lots of realignment is going on.
Yeah, and there's just a desire to sort of try and feel like Donald Trump is still on the reservation and, act as though he is still, a viable leader for America, given that he's, quite has a very good chance of being the next president. Any one of these leaders, any one of these business people will have to interact with him or his officials. So there's also just a basic kind of self-preservation aspect that, the world is such that, they will have to deal with whoever's the president. And if it looks like it might be Donald Trump, there's no point trying to suggest that, it'll be, that he is some impossible to deal with character, because you're going to have to deal with him.
But Stephanie, if you break down, the impact on the economy, so is it almost automatically inflationary because it'll be, less globalist? We could potentially see more supply chain disruption between the US and China. And so actually, if you're European, you're kind of stuck in the middle and you're not sure what to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, of course, the one thing he has said in the way of policies on the economic front is the 10% tariff on all imported goods. And we actually did the numbers on that with Bloomberg Economics the other day. And it's obviously, as economists would say, it's not very good for real incomes and for consumers in the US. I think we found 45 out of 50 states where it was going to be a modest hit to real income. Because remember, even if you may have helped the odd mining company or auto plant, you're increasing the price of all these imports that people buy and other businesses buy. Ironically, China does quite well, we noticed, because of course there's lots of very high tariffs on China anyway, so it wouldn't necessarily be a big hit for them. But the countries like Mexico that Chinese exporters are competing with would suddenly face this tariff, at least if he goes through on that promise of 10% across the board. So, that kind of thing at the margin could sort of further disrupt global trade, add to inflation a little bit in the US. But, as ever with these things, one is still thinking more about the uncertainty and more about what kind of policies you'd be looking at across the board from the US. We don't know really what his stance against China will be. It could be that he'll be a bit more conciliatory with Xi Jinping than President Biden has been, given that he seems to have a bit of a penchant for dictators.
Stephanie, how difficult is it just to have a template on, the economics under Donald Trump? Because some of the policies were made on a whim. It was on social media. So because they're not pre-announced, it's actually quite difficult to know right now what, he'll do on the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the linchpins that are benefiting the U.S. economy, although he may not agree with the underlying premise of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's been so much part of, and we saw that in New Hampshire, in Iowa, a big part of the pitch to voters for Trump has been the comparison between, what their economic situation was under Trump versus what it's been under Biden. And of course, we could argue there were lots of, that Putin's invasion of Ukraine had quite a lot to do with that. The timing of COVID had quite a lot to do with that contrast. But having made that big economic pitch, actually, we're not hearing that much from Donald Trump in the way of new economic policies, apart from the one I just talked about. In fact, he's focused more on, as far as we can see, increasing executive power. So trying to reduce the influence of the individual departments and regulators in the US. So that would potentially suggest, much less environmental regulation and definitely a kind of wind down in the Inflation Reduction Act. We've heard a lot about immigration and potentially, some thought about maybe using the American army on US soil to confront illegal immigration. So, there is a bit of a disconnect that although a lot of he's been sort of talking about Biden's economic failures, he hasn't been proposing a lot of concrete new economic policies that we could focus on.
I think the other thing that's been, to sort of bring it back to the UK, the other thing that perhaps this week will be the first time people will start to process it, is if we have an autumn election, and I don't think, and none of us know, but if we have an autumn election, which is timed roughly around the same time as what we now think is quite likely to be Biden versus Trump, and you have more and more of this bellicose language that he is so fond of, I think, firstly, we are not used to having an election in this country which has got another election that's very relevant and important happening at the same time. It's suffusing and intermingling with the language and the debates that are being had in the UK and that are not completely irrelevant. So I think, firstly, that's the kind of the backdrop. If you've got Trump saying repeatedly, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And that is a debating point as well that will play in our election. I think it is going to be unusual to have that sort of double narrative playing through potentially our own election.
Yeah, and I often find, there is an interesting way, Allegra, it's a bit like, we all watch, American TV kind of permeates our consciousness. And there's also been a sort of equivalent to that in economics, that the big economic debates in the US, we tend to sort of transpose onto the UK, like rising inequality and other things that, and the flat real wages, which has been true in the US and actually less true in the UK. I think that would be the risk if you have kind of simultaneous parallel campaigns. I guess if the betting is potentially the UK election would be 2 weeks after the presidential election, maybe in November, you could find that there were sort of people were importing debates from the US campaign that actually are less relevant for the UK. We haven't had a very good recovery from COVID like the US has had. We have a different kind of inflation problem. We certainly have a very different kind of energy situation. And yet, there's a risk that we'll sort of find ourselves having the same arguments as they are having in the US. I think
all of that's true. I also think there will be things said, and both the big political leaders, Sunak and Starmer, will come under different pressure to respond to them. So, from Sunak's perspective, this has been said in America, do you agree? And he'll have a kind of one set of political calculations to go through. But the same will be true of Starmer. If, he's looking like he's becoming the next prime minister, he'll come under pressure from the left of his party to just, say this is outrageous, how dare you, et cetera, et cetera. And he'll probably, need to keep quiet for the reasons we sort of started this podcast, which is, people will have to work with each other in, 12 months' time.
Yeah, there's also an interesting thing. If all the debate is about Bidenomics, or at least if there's quite a lot of debate about Bidenomics and whether it works, it sort of makes it a complicated argument for Keir Starmer, right? Because, there's certainly been elements of the Biden approach to the economy that the Rachel Reeves and others on the Labour side are trying to emulate. But if they're also trying to kind of distance themselves from a president who looks like he might be about to lose, I think that too could be a bit complicated. But then, that's there's equally a problem for Donald Trump that, in effect, lots of the Biden economics policies are actually a sort of, putting into practice things that he had talked about, wanting the US to be more competitive. Well, actually, arguably, the Biden administration has done more to invest in infrastructure and American businesses than Donald Trump did. So I think, there'll be an interesting debate on that happening on the other side of the Atlantic as well.
Stephanie, if Donald Trump actually does better in the polls in the next couple of months, does it shift the conversation in the UK more to the right? Or do investors look at the UK and say, look, given the two parties and the fact that they're not that far apart in terms of policies, the UK could look a bit like a safe haven?
Yeah, I think the UK looking like it's sort of bucking the trend with two quite normal, relatively boring contenders for number 10, I think could be helpful. As you know, Francine, in recent years, it's been quite hard to persuade people of the merits of the UK stock market. But I think there could certainly be an element of that if you feel like, US politics has gone down this rather sort of unedifying path yet again, And the UK has actually kind of rescued itself from Liz Truss and other craziness, and has actually now got two very sort of traditional, relatively middle of the road politicians, at least in the way that they present themselves.
If you're an Eastern European country right now, you are probably quivering because of the dynamic, the things he's on the record about saying around NATO spending and defending Ukraine. I mean, I think we're having this debate now in London focused on economics, but the defense aspect and a possibly more isolationist stance from Donald Trump, whether or not it comes to be true, because he is totally capable of saying one thing and then doing completely the other. But people have talked about it being a nightmare scenario for them, haven't they, Fran?
Yeah, they have. I mean, if I could have, we should do, Stephanie, a show just on the eye rolls of policymakers in Davos when you ask them about, whether it was possible to Trump-proof the economy. I think the finance minister of Germany said, look, we're just talking too much about Donald Trump. Is there a way of Europe and others to Trump-proof the economy?
I mean, if I were them, I'd be much more concerned about Trump-proofing, the security of Eastern Europe. I mean, just to go back to Allegra's point, I think that is where sort of under the surface where the concerns would have to be. If you have a leader coming in who has got an ambiguous at best relationship towards President Putin, and whose election just in itself will send a signal to a lot of sort of powers around the world that the sort of US policeman is not going to be around, or at least could be easily bought off in one way or another. That both President Biden and President Trump have been sort of in some ways America first politicians. But the difference, of course, with Biden is it's not been America only, whereas President Trump is very much sort of focused on just the US alone, not the broader security of the world. If you're sitting in Poland or Moldova, which could easily be next in President Putin's sights, let alone Latvia, I think, there isn't a lot of Trump proofing, even though President Macron, for example, in France is definitely talking about the need for Europe to have a response.
I mean, one of the other things that, people now talk about after New Hampshire is, how did anyone ever think that they could beat Donald Trump as a Republican candidate? What's his pull? For if you're sitting in Europe, you kind of think, well, why is he so liked?
I mean, he has managed to turn around. He's managed to play the liberal establishment against itself brilliantly, and we've all seen this again and again. But the series of legal cases, I think, probably have sort of sealed it for him, because they can sort of send a signal. He can say, look, this is what they're doing to me. Imagine what they could do to you, and I'm standing there defending you against this, against a sort of liberal state that wants to take all your money and wants to, send the US to the dogs. So, he has been he has pulled off that coup. And I guess he was allowed to do that because he was never really punished for January 6th, which people thought, was going to be the end of him. But his party sort of collectively gave him a pass, and then that enabled him to sort of rebuild his support. But it will go down as a pretty extraordinary political career to have pulled off.
But isn't he treading a fine line, which is difficult for him with his instinct to kind of be a showman? But isn't there a kind of worry amongst some voters of him wanting revenge? And he, whilst you're right, it's a motivating factor for them, the idea of this underdog being, beaten up legally by the Democrats. So in some senses, it is motivating and galvanizing for him, but he has to be careful not to be too hell-bent on revenge and getting his own back. And so you see that in the narratives, his rhetoric. After Iowa, he was quite sort of, magisterial and statesmanlike. And then last night this morning, he was pretty vile about his opponent.
Yeah, I think he's, this is, of course, what the Biden administration will tell you. They'll say, ignore the polls. This is all in a vacuum. When you actually when you're facing the choice between the two, and when Donald Trump is much more omnipresent on not just his own social media platforms, but, broadcast news and other areas, when he's now out on the road campaigning again, people will be reminded, how exhausting it is dealing with his sort of sallies every day and his constant moving back and forth on different views. And they will kind of want the quieter life that comes with, old man Biden. There could be a lot of truth to that, but we just don't know yet.
I guess one of the most extraordinary things is also when Donald Trump started speaking about China, and, some of the antagonizing things he said about China, people were horrified, and now it's really mainstream. I mean, are there other points where he's really set the agenda on economics and the way that the US will behave?
I mean, I do think that in many ways the Biden administration has operationalized a lot of the sort of Trump rhetoric on China and what had gone wrong with the US and the unfair global trading system. They kind of took it seriously. They kept quite a lot of his tariffs in place against China, but they also put all of these domestic policies in place that were about specifically competing with China and also trying to slow down China's own development. It was the Biden administration that actually put limits on, exports to China of very high level superconductor technologies and other things. So that's why I think it's interesting that there will be quite a lot of policies that are part of Bidenomics that Donald Trump should find completely consistent with his view. I think, again, just going back on the national security, ultimately the relationship with China comes down not just to the US's economic reliance on China, but also how far the US will continue to invest in sort of being a counterbalance to China in geopolitical terms in Asia. And that is the great unknown, when it goes back to this point about America first versus America only. Is Donald Trump really going to want to defend Taiwan and continue to send those kind of supporting messages to Taiwan? And, if not, where does that leave actually all of the economic producers who are so utterly dependent on Taiwan semiconductors? That's why I was a little bit surprised in Davos that business people weren't a little bit more focused on those kind of question marks, because we just don't know which side he's going to be on.
Stephanie, thank you so much. Thanks for listening to this week's In the City. We'll be back next week, but in the meantime, if you like our show, please head on over to wherever you listen to podcasts, rate, review, and subscribe. It helps people find the show. This episode was hosted by me, Francine Lacqua, and Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi, additional editing by Blake Maples, and special thanks to Stephanie Flanders. And we also want to flag the relaunch of the London Rush newsletter. We'll sign up to get briefed ahead of your morning calls with the latest UK business headlines, key data, but also market reaction with Bloomberg UK's new morning newsletter. Link is in the show notes.